this land has been, home to many societies and cultures well before it became, what we know of as Arkansas today. But I think it's been so interesting to spend time in these places and see the way that the land itself reflects these histories, even as, the work that has been done to sort of maybe cover over or sort of lay claim to land as a sort of, we arrived in the 1800s and we built these farms and these plantations, and that's where history begins. But actually, if you look at these places, you see these threads that extend way farther back than what we think of as US history.
So while at Hard Mountain, most people pull over off the highway because they see a smokestack. Then they find a museum. Then they go up on the hill and they overlook a big field and they learn about the barracks that were there. And then what causes them, as they look up, they start looking at Hart Mountain themselves. And it's very natural for people to ask themselves a series of questions. Who was there? Why they were there? How were they treated? What went on? And those sorts of stuff. And as you layer that through the history of Japanese American incarceration, it's very natural then to go into what other individuals were in this area. And so if you talk to some of our Nisei at Hart Mountain, they're going to tell you stories about being children at the camp and finding arrowheads. And so some of those connections that some of the camps are going to feel a real connection to than the experiences during World War II and some of the experiences of local tribes in the 1870s in terms of the government's response, the government's action, and the government's denial of what are basic human rights, let alone constitutional protections.
And I think also with, thinking about memory and place and history, there's something about understanding the ways that sites change, as we've talked about and as has come up, but also the way that these places hold memory in different ways for people, that returning to a site can bring up both a sense of pain, sometimes sadness, sometimes memories of joy. A lot of the folks I talked to at this point were kids in camp or were high school students, and they have sort of some happy memories of being at this place, even though they know it was a prison and they knew it was a prison then. And then you talk with folks who moved into the area afterwards, who often didn't have a connection to the site, didn't know that there were Japanese Americans there, and to try and sort out with them what it means to live near this place, I think is really significant and lends a certain kind of meaning that also helps us understand the present. Because if we can think about the ways that our memories imbue certain places with meaning, then it helps us see, where we've gotten to, what these places mean to us today, and how we can use them to sort of better understand the past and solve some of these problems and tensions that come up in the present. One of the most powerful ways that Japanese American history has been sort of remembered and brought to the forefront for so many of us, both just as individuals, as communities, has been through this sort of first person narrative, has been through our elders who were willing to tell their story, who were willing to, stand up and organize and say, like, this thing that happened to us or that happened to our parents, that happened to our community wasn't right. And so, in the 80s, there was this incredible movement to tell these stories that culminated in redress for Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated and an apology, which was incredibly important for so many ways and has helped preserve the storytelling around this history.
Well, there's many things to remember. In my opinion, and the way I give my talks, I start out with the theme, the history. A great country does not hide history. And for such a long time, this country has had a trend to not reveal important history about what happened. And what happened in our case was the racial hate that drove some of the leaders to decide to remove a single race in clear violation of everyone's civil rights. And it took place here. And people should remember that this combination of hate and mass hysteria and a few leaders who made the wrong decision that resulted in a place like this. And they should never forget it. And they should do everything they can in the future to make sure that that combination, hatred, hysteria, and some leaders will not do such a thing again.
But how do the ways that we remember need to change when we can't ask our elders to tell us about their experiences anymore? And this is where I think, as a historian, as a community member, I really value art, and I really value the ways that history can be expressed, not just through, books, which are so wonderful, or articles and all of these things, but that someone could, write a poem that's about their ancestors, their stories, or their experiences returning to some of these sites, learning about this history. It could be music, it could be painting, all of these pieces that exist within Japanese American history. Some of the things that we, treasure so much as storytelling devices are art.
For example, teachers that teach artwork and propaganda then could bring in cartoons. Those in our journalism classes were using portions of the camp newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel. Our art teachers were bringing in lessons. And so it made all of us better to work collaboratively to see how we could create a more rich narrative of the history and the message and the story of the place that we call Heart Mountain.
And to me, I think that's really powerful, to look at archival photographs of what Rower looked like, and then to look at it now and see how quickly things can change, and that the stories that the land can tell are not always immediately obvious, and that there's sort of a benefit to having the land tell its own story, asking folks who've lived there to tell you what they remember, what things looked like. Because, otherwise you could look at this space where there's just the cemetery. That's all that's left of Rower. At Jerome, there's just one smokestack that you can see sort of off in the distance. It can be really hard to sort of imagine what those cities looked like in these places, but there are all these ways that sort of the land and the communities around maintain the memory, or that these memories just sort of keep coming back up.
Both sides of my family are Japanese American, and both sides of my family were incarcerated. My mother was incarcerated in Minidoka, Idaho, her family, and my father's family was incarcerated at Tule Lake in California. And we talked about this history a lot when I was young, and so I grew up understanding and knowing about this history. And so we had in our family a sense of social justice, and to help stand up for people when their rights are being taken away, or just if they're just being wronged.
And so some of the work of remembering is also thinking about, okay, how do we tell these stories? How do we honor our ancestors, but in ways that, have an impact on the present? How do we pull out patterns for folks to see? Not that Japanese American history is the only way to trace how, systems of immigration and exclusion and incarceration function, but it's a really interesting lens, I think, into sort of understanding how we've gotten to the various situations that we find ourselves in today. And some of that is recognizing within the Japanese American community how we can better align ourselves with, how we can better, reach across lines of community and race. And so I think about a lot of the work of just leaving those silences there and finding ways to do sort of historical work that acknowledges that there are so many voices we'll never hear, and that that's okay, and to use those silences to help us listen better, sit better with communities around us too.
And too many people in this country don't know the existence of these kinds of events that happened in our history. And they need to know so they can be better prepared, so it will never happen again to others. That's the reason why it's important to learn. That's the reason why it's important to everyone to know. I feel very confident that the young people of today know a lot more than the people of my generation did when I was young. That they would know better that something like this should not happen. But they need to know more facts about what really happened. They need to have that, they need to be armed with that kind of information so they can present and be knowledgeable of these important events that happened. to make sure it won't happen to them. I really feel for, the friends and relatives and the children of today's young people. They've got to be educated. They need to learn better. The entire country needs to know better. And that's what's important.